So everybody knows who I am probably. And so just to get things started, my name is Marquis Cabrera. I work for IBM, clearly or evidently. And I lead our digital transformation team globally, a role that I recently started or transitioned to from a role as an advisor for HHS. And so today, the topic of the conversation essentially is a cognitive government and transforming the business of government. The first thing I want to do, though, before I get kickstarted is, so who actually works for a government agency? Can you tell me what agency you work for?
Board of Equalization.
Okay. What about you?
General Services.
General Services?
Same.
Okay.
Energy Commission.
Okay.
CalPERS.
CalPERS? Awesome. And you guys back there? Does anybody work for an agency? Okay, awesome. So I just want to get a flavor. So if you don't work for an agency, do you work for industry? Okay, awesome. And so Deloitte, Microsoft, Accenture?
Any of those.
Okay, awesome. So just to get started, the topic of conversation today, again, just to reiterate, is the cognitive government. And we're going to talk about cognitive as applied to government. And I'm going to walk you through what cognitive is, give you a baseline for how to use cognitive, give you some potential use cases, talk about what IBM does with regards to cognitive. And then I'm not going to walk through every single use case, so the PowerPoint will be shared. So if you want on your own leisure, you can go through and see how we've applied cognitive in many different ways from an analytics perspective and otherwise. So just to get kickstarted, a little bit about me. Everybody always asks me, they see my background and oftentimes they're intimidated to come and actually say hello. And so I'm afraid of spiders. I love to eat bad foods. I'm literally working off some bad food right now. But one of the things that got me started in the government sector was working at the White House. And I don't typically share what I do did at the White House oftentimes. So I figured just to tell you how that relates to cognitive transformation and digital transformation. So the first question I get is, since you worked at the White House, did you meet the president? I met the president, wrote a memo for the president. When he met with Joseph Blatter, I ended up meeting the first lady, pitching to the first lady. That was awesome. When I met the president the first time, I couldn't get words out of my mouth, or a former president. And so, but what got me started in the IT space with regards to government was IT dashboard. And so when I first started at the White House, I remember Anish Chopra talking about looking at how do we understand federal financial data in real time. And so he kickstarted a project to understand in real time what was happening and to give the president a dashboard of federal agency spend in real time. And then he was like, hey, I want you to do two things. One is I want you to go work with the Recovery Implementation Office, which was huge at the time. And the Recovery Act was sort of, an RO was one of the president's biggest initiatives with regards to the stimulus. And so this sort of thinking that precipitated IT dashboard came back to the Recovery Office. So for example, the president wanted to see what was happening in multiple locations, specifically North Carolina was one I was focused on, with regards to Recovery Act funding at a zip code level. And so we developed a website for the president to actually see what was happening in recovery with Recovery Act funding in specific geos. So when he traveled around the country, he could say, hey, Recovery Act funding has gone to this, and so forth. What was even more interesting was to take a step beyond that. And when we started to do Recovery Act funding, it was the first time in history that we asked folks to report in mom and pop stores, to report into government what they were doing with funding. And so we said, okay, so we built a system. Same thing, I leave this up to just give you some thoughts behind it. Same thing was like, let's show transparency, let's build in that transparency. And so we ended up building, I don't have a graphic of it, but what we ended up taking was a system the EPA built and creating a mechanism by which to allow for reporting guidance on the MO921 guidance around Recovery React funding. And so that sort of kick-started me in the space of IT with regards to government. And everybody always asks, like, how did you get engaged and where did it start? And it started with IT Dashboard. And then it followed up with those extra 2 projects. And then after that, I started doing a lot more things. And so I created RateMyFosterHome.com, which was the first mover to introduce CX metrics into the child welfare space. I ended up selling the company for a substantial amount of money. I created a company called PhysioCare.io that just got valued at $3 million. And we're Uberizing physical therapy right before I started IBM. And so I was super, super interested in the government tech space with regards to health and human services and how to move the needle forward there. And so the biggest thing I learned, though, was all about data, right? Like everybody talks about data, and the biggest thing was I learned was to take data, turn it into insights, and actually act on it. And oftentimes, the president would see a budget and say, okay, like where was this coming from? Or like, the spend here is the same as here. How can we, decrease spend across all agencies with the OMB? And so essentially, we started taking data, analyzing it, and turning it into insights. And that really started kickstarting the dashboard movement, which is what I really cared about, especially with regards to child welfare. You allow kids to tell you what's happening in their home. You allow foster parents to tell you what's happening in their home. You aggregate the statistics, so to speak, be it a number or Boolean, so to speak, and then you visualize the data for a social worker supervisor on the back end. And so they were able to see insights in real time as far as happiness in the home, what was happening in a home, and so forth. And so that's why I personally love that idea, and that's what I learned leaving the White House, was how do we take data and turn it into actionable insights in a way that's really, really meaningful, one for the agency and also for the citizen. So just to fast forward, everybody always says, we're living in an age of digital disruption, right? And what does that mean? We look at Skype and we look at Airbnb and we look at Facebook. You probably have seen this graphic previously, and Alibaba, and they have some companies own no infrastructure. They have no physical locations, but what they are data companies. And so they're massive data companies. If you think about the reasons why Tumblr got an acquisition is because they were a data company. If you think about the reason why WhatsApp got an acquisition, it was because they were a data company. And so just to get you kickstarted, we're living in this age of digital disruption. And so and our lives become more personalized. Not sure that's a good thing to some extent, and connected than ever before. And so from Facebook to LinkedIn to Amazon and so forth. And so we all know the world has changed. I think this is sort of a really good graphic to visualize that actual change from the hand to the robot. And I took a course at CMU that talked about how synthetic robotics, so eventually you actually won't even see the robot's hand, you'll see a human hand underlying a robot, which is pretty cool. And technology has changed us all. And I think this is also a pretty good representation of our data and how when we make movements and so forth, you can actually capture that data. So this is an analysis. We did the same thing with sports, where if someone makes a movement, you can sort of capture their patterns and so forth, but that's a great visualization of that as well. And so the problem that we're seeing from a government perspective is that industry has changed the world. Entrepreneurs and innovators have changed the world, and governments are struggling to keep pace. We're seeing that right now with blockchain due to lack of regulatory issuance around the actual blockchain. I know I listened to a talk on NPR with the head of the Treasury talking about blockchain and how they would like to start to craft some regulation around it, and so specifically with various use cases on government. And so government's struggling to keep pace, and we're moving at a rapid pace, right? And so per talking to government offices, a lot of government offices say, hey, we want to invest in innovation. There's a lot of problems we have with investing in innovation and moving forward, right? And if we want to introduce blockchain into our tooling, if we want to introduce IoT, if we want to introduce any other new technology, we're struggling. One, we don't have people who have the competence and understand it. And then two, most of our money is tied up in legacy systems. Duh, we built most of them. And so most of our money is tied up in legacy systems. and there's no freedom for OpEx funding, right? And so the question is, how do you move from legacy to OpEx and start freeing up that OpEx funding so you can start using it to invest in innovation on the front end instead of the back end? So in our opinion, in our point of view, in IBM, cognitive government changes the game. And so cognitive government, we put a stake in the ground. Everybody's talking about, digital government, smart government. Gartner talks about smart government. We put a stake in the ground and said we want every government agency to aspire to be a cognitive government. That seems a bit ubiquitous. It's like, what does that mean, Marquis? And so I'm going to tell you what that means in just 1 second. So before I give you a definition, I want you to imagine, right? So imagine a government that constantly outthinks the status quo, right? Just imagine if it constantly outthinks the status quo. If it was adaptive, personalized to your need, your whim, where you want it, how you wanted it, and just imagine what that would be like. Recently, I applied for a tax extension, and I had to go to an actual location to file a tax extension specifically for Massachusetts and California. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, why do I have to go to the post office? I can't just do this online. And so I was pretty frustrated. The federal government fortunately allows you to do it, but many states don't actually allow you to do it. So that's just an example of, imagine if I could just do this online, have it be seamless whenever I wanted to do it, and I didn't have to go to a store. So the thing that we looked at so far is the problem that government has is everybody talks about digitization. Government, it has many pockets of excellence, but it's happening in silos. And so when you think about it, we've moved from paper government to e-government to digital government. But even when we move to digital government, many of those actions are still happening in silos. And so when you think of, why Karen wanted to put on an event like this, she's specifically interested in, the data sharing policies and so forth, and wants to knock down some of those silos and start to share the data in so much that, we're allowed to move towards a cognitive government, and innovation in digital government is not just happening in one specific agency where a politician has a priority, right? Or a vested interest. So what we really, really need is a genuine transformation. So to go from paper to basic e-government to advanced e-government to digital government to cognitive government. And so I know a lot of folks think about, or probably have seen if you're interested in technology, Black Mirror. Sometimes it scares the hell out of me. And so ultimately you want government to interact sort of seamlessly and operate in a no type of way. And hence the reason why I love this visual. And so to keep pace with change, there's a couple of different things that we think would be really, really beneficial. The first is being citizen-driven. The second is being on demand, like I talked about wanting to fill out my taxes and not having to go to a store when I was in Brussels. And then the other one is responsive, right? So if I come to you, to government, and say, hey, I have a request, I need to fulfill that request, be fast and rapid with your response. That's what I get from industry, that's what I get from Facebook when I want to talk to my friends, that's what I get from many different banks. The bank texted me when I was in Brussels yesterday and said, hey, did you make this charge, are you in this location, can you please text and confirm right now? And I was like, that's awesome, I'm here. So when I think of government, that's what I think about. So the next step is it's time for cognitive 4.0, right? When you think of basic government and O'Reilly and what Tim O'Reilly talked about, what Jim Pelk has been pushing from a Code for America perspective, and many of the folks who've crafted the thinking around government and digital government, the next step in our opinion, and our point of view, is a cognitive government 4.0. A government that essentially takes the citizen and puts them at the center of everything, and then starts to craft interactions and leverage technology and services and puts them at the center of the citizen, right? So the cognitive government tomorrow puts the citizen at the center and then builds around the citizen. And so we believe there's some emerging technologies, and I'll take a quick backtrack and say this. When you think of, and I've heard this a couple of times already, when you think of Watson, you think of Watson as a big, and I didn't want to say this to the guy who was sitting in front of me because it biased my judgment at least. When you think of Watson, you typically think of a computer. Like you think of Jeopardy, you think of, hey, this big super brain. And Watson is actually, it's a name of our founder, but it's also a brand. So Watson is a brand in which our cognitive computing technologies fall under. So our cognitive computing technologies are the artificial intelligence capabilities that we have that fall under the Watson brand. So if you think of like a P&G, and then you think of Tide, and you think of all the other companies and brands that they have underneath it, I would think of Watson as the big AI brand that we have, but it's not the actual, it's the name by which we reference, but there's other sub pieces underneath it that have our computing technology. So when you think of Watson and you leave today, what I hope is you say, hey, like they have Watson, but there's different capabilities that Watson has. So like we have Watson in every single vertical, from healthcare to education to oncology, and there's a Watson for each vertical. And so essentially what a cognitive government is government plus cognitive computing equals cognitive government. So it's not cognitive plus Watson equals cognitive computing, a cognitive government. It's cognitive plus, or government plus cognitive computing equals cognitive government. And so everybody always asks, how do we get to cognitive government? There's many different ways to get there. The first thing that we're seeing today is the rise of the Internet of Things and devices. A lot of people think of Internet of Things as actual connectivity. In my opinion, it's connectivity and, meaning that it's connectivity and the ability to analyze and bring together disparate pieces of data and information. So it's the connectivity and I would think about. I'd also think about the blockchain. Everybody knows that we have Hyperledger, it's open source. If you wanted to, you could go pull up Bluemix and build a blockchain application if you wanted to. I did that last week. It was a lot of fun. And then we also think about artificial intelligence. So I would say that artificial intelligence still falls under that cognitive computing capability. And then, leveraging IBM's full suite of services. So we're not just a tech company, we also have a ton of services. So we do design thinking, we have an interactive experience team, we have a Bluemix Garage team that does prototyping, and we have analytics capabilities. I work across every single asset class we have, which is called CAMS. So it's cloud, analytics, mobile, social, and security. And each of those asset classes is applicable to every single niche and industry. And so, yeah. And then everybody talks about, so I'll take a backstep just to give you the story. So we leverage emerging technologies in IBM's full suite of services. And then we move into to reinvent public service delivery. So everybody always asks, what does that mean? So you could have cognitive networks, you could have cognitive aging, you could have cognitive transportation, you could have a cognitive workforce, you could have cognitive infrastructure, and you could have cognitive delivery. So I separated it up in this slide to give you examples of what you could do specifically in your own organizations with regards to cognitive. I'm not saying and preaching come work with IBM. Most people don't realize this, but we compete. So we work with Microsoft, we work with Deloitte. We actually have some integrated accounts with Microsoft. And we just announced our big partnership with Salesforce, who also has some AI capabilities. So I'm not saying preaching come work with those, but I'm saying that our biggest value proposition is we can work across every single niche, every single vertical, and apply cognitive in your area of expertise or your area of government. So what does that mean once we move into a cognitive government? In my opinion, it results in a 21st century government that is lean, modern, and personalized for the needs of citizens. And when you can do that, you ultimately transform a citizen's experiences. You no longer have to go wait in a line and do anything. You can just do it online. You can self-service, and it gets much more easier. Tasks are automated. Legacy modernization is moved forward. And to give you an example of what I'm talking about, actually I'll wait till later to give you the example. So in our opinion and our point of view is that a cognitive government is where government should be headed. And it's not this sort of pie in the sky, oh, I don't know what cognitive is, we need to buy a big computer. No. It's small. You can do small things with cognitive. You could have a small talent advisor, implement it into your workloads. You could have cognitive business processes that learn on their own or improve by themselves. So there's different things you can introduce cognitive in a multitude of ways, and so that's our point of view. And then this is where I get into the meat. Does anybody have any questions really quickly? I think you're going to be really, really excited about this. I'm personally super excited about this. And so this is actually some of the most fresh thinking we've come up with at IBM as of late. And so in our opinion, when you think about government, we've adapted our point of view with regards to cognitive transformation from the UN study. So we've said there's basic e-government, there's advanced e-government, there's digital government, and there's cognitive government. And so when you think of basic e-government, you think of, let's just take paperless, right? When you think of advanced e-government, you think of a two-way interaction, so you're able to download something from the internet. When you think of digital government, you think of interaction between citizens, you start to co-create, and when you think of cognitive government, you start to think of chatbots, you start to think of robo-advisors, and so forth. So if you think about how this has played out throughout the course of history so far in the short-lived history of the internet, when you're in basic and advanced e-government, you're traditionally working in silos. When you're in advanced e-government and you're in digital government, you're working sort of in shared services capacities. And when you're in cognitive government, or you're in digital government moving to cognitive government, you're ultimately working in a co-creative way. So you essentially move from basic e-government, which is citizen-centric, to cognitive government and digital government, which is citizen-driven. And if we're going to move the needle forward in government and catch up to industry, we ultimately have to become citizen-driven. And so instead of operating silos, instead of thinking about shared services, think about co-creation and think about how do we become citizen-driven.